The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless tyrant. It beat down on the single dusty street, bleaching the raw lumber of the buildings to the color of bone and baking the earth into a cracked, hostile plain. The town was a scar on the face of the landscape, a place carved out of rock and sand by men whose hearts had long since taken on the character of their surroundings. Hard, unforgiving, and barren of softness. A thin, hot wind whispered through the alleyways, carrying not relief but the smell of dust, sweat, and a simmering resentment that clung to everything like a sickness. This was a town that breathed hate as if it were air. It was ruled, in all but name, by Silas Thorne. His sprawling cattle empire choked the plains for 100 miles in every direction, and his will was the only true law in the gulch. His brand was on the cattle, his name was on the saloon, and his shadow fell over every soul who lived there. The land had no mercy, and it had taught the people the same. They were a suspicious, hard-bitten lot, quick to judge and slow to forgive, their faces weathered into permanent scowls by the sun and their own sour dispositions. Kindness was a currency they did not trade in, for it was seen as a weakness, and in a place like this, weakness was a death sentence. Into this crucible rode a man who was the living embodiment of everything the town despised. His name was Ethan Blackwood, though his mother's people had called him Kavi, the coyote. He sat his buckskin mare with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle, his posture straight, his movements economical. He was a man caught between two worlds, and welcome in neither. From his white father, he had inherited a tall, rangy frame and a certain set to his jaw, but his mother's Comanche blood showed in the high, sharp planes of his cheekbones, the straight line of his black hair that fell past his shoulders, and the obsidian darkness of his eyes. Those eyes missed nothing. They swept over the town with a quiet, watchful intensity, absorbing every detail, assessing every threat. As he rode down the main street, a subtle change rippled through the town. Conversations on the boardwalks faltered and died. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer stuttered into silence. Men who had been lounging in the shade of the general store's porch slowly straightened, their hands drifting near the pistols on their hips. Women scurried their children indoors, casting fearful, venomous glances over their shoulders. Ethan felt their stares like a physical weight, a familiar pressure he had borne his entire life. He heard the muttered words, too low to be clear but their meaning as sharp as a blade. Half-breed, savage. He kept his face a mask of stoic indifference, his gaze fixed forward. He had not come here for trouble. He had come for flour, salt, and cartridges. Simple necessities that required him to endure this gauntlet of silent animosity. He had learned long ago that to show anger was to give them a victory. To show fear was to invite a fight. And so he showed nothing at all, his silence a shield he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He swung down from his horse in front of Thorne's Saloon, the largest and loudest building in town. The sound of a tinny piano and coarse laughter spilled out through the swinging doors, a promise of life that he knew was not meant for him. He tied his horse to the hitching rail, giving the mare a reassuring pat on the neck before turning to face the entrance. For a moment, he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stay out in the open, under the wide, indifferent sky where a man could see his enemies coming, but his canteen was nearly empty, and the dust of the trail had caked his throat into a dry rasp. It was just a glass of water. A simple thing. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap whiskey. A haze of blue smoke hung in the air, catching the slivers of afternoon sun that pierced the gloom. Ilara moved through the chaos like a ghost. She had been in Redemption Gulch for 6 months, a tenure that already made her one of the longest-serving maids at Thorne's establishment. She worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, clearing empty glasses and wiping down sticky tables, her movements graceful and unobtrusive. She had a weary sort of beauty, with pale skin that seemed out of place in this sunburnt land, and eyes the color of a twilight sky. But those eyes held a deep, profound sadness, a story of some past trouble that she kept carefully hidden. She had come to the gulch to escape, to disappear. Her goal was to be invisible, to earn enough to move on to somewhere else, somewhere green, somewhere the past could not find her. She kept to herself, her words few and her smiles even rarer. A silent, resilient spirit in a world of noise and brutality. She was wiping down a table near the back when the swinging doors creaked open. The effect was immediate and absolute. The boisterous laughter cut off mid-guffaw. The piano player's hands froze over the keys, leaving a single, discordant note hanging in the air. The low hum of conversation vanished, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Every head in the room turned toward the door. Elara looked up. Following their hostile gaze, she saw him standing there, a silhouette against the blinding glare of the street. He was tall, and his shoulders were broad under a worn buckskin shirt. As he stepped further into the room and the light fell upon his face, she saw the sharp cheekbones and the dark, steady eyes. She felt the chill that passed through the saloon, the collective intake of breath, the sudden tension that was as thick as the smoke. She had seen prejudice before, but the pure, undiluted venom in that room was something new. It was a living thing, a predator that had just scented its prey. Ethan ignored the stares. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace to the long wooden bar. The sound of his worn boots unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. He stopped, leaving a respectful distance between himself and the other patrons, who subtly shuffled away from him as if he carried a plague. The bartender, a corpulent man with a greasy apron and a face like a bulldog, was polishing a glass. He saw Ethan. His lip curled into a sneer, and he deliberately turned his back, continuing to wipe the same spot on the glass with exaggerated care. Ethan waited. He stood there for a full minute, a silent, solitary figure in a room full of hate. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon, a challenge. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm, devoid of any inflection that could be mistaken for weakness or aggression. "Just a glass of water, please." The bartender grunted, a sound of pure contempt. He did not turn around. "We ain't serving your kind here," he rasped, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. A few nervous chuckles broke the silence, which then grew heavier than before. From her corner of the room, Elara watched, her heart a tight, cold knot in her chest. She saw the man at the bar, saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the iron control he held over himself. But she also saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the parched look of his lips. He was not a threat. He was not a savage. He was a man. Tired and thirsty, asking for the most basic of human decencies, and he was being denied it for no other reason than the blood that ran in his veins. In that moment, something within her shifted. She thought of her own past, of all the times she had been judged and condemned by cruel, ignorant men. Her carefully constructed wall of invisibility crumbled. She could not stand by and watch this. She set down her cleaning rag. Her hands were steady as she walked behind the bar to a wooden bucket filled with water from the well out back. The cleanest water in the place. She picked up a glass, ignoring the bartender's furious, red-faced glare. She filled it to the brim, the clear, cool water a stark contrast to the foulness of the room. Holding the glass, she walked out from behind the bar. Every eye was on her. She could feel their shock, their disapproval, but her gaze was fixed on the man. She walked the length of the room, the sawdust muffling her footsteps, and stopped at an empty table near where he stood. She placed the glass of water down on the wood. The sound was a small, defiant click in the suffocating silence. She looked up at him. Their eyes met, and in that brief, silent exchange, a universe of understanding passed between them. His dark eyes, which had been so guarded and unreadable, softened for a fraction of a second. She saw in them a gratitude so profound it went far beyond mere thirst. It was the gratitude of a man who had expected nothing and had just been given a small piece of his humanity back. And in her own gaze, She offered him a silent apology. For the town, for the cruelty, for a world that could be so heartless. It was a fleeting connection, a spark of light in a vast darkness, but it was real. He moved to the table, his eyes never leaving hers. He picked up the glass and drank the water in long, slow swallows. He drained the entire glass before setting it back down gently. He reached into a small leather pouch on his belt and pulled out a coin. It was not a penny or a nickel, but a silver dollar, its surface gleaming in the dim light. He placed it on the table beside the empty glass. It was a fortune for a glass of water, a payment not for the drink, but for the risk she had taken, for the decency she had shown. He gave her a single, formal nod of his head. It was a gesture of immense respect. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the silver coin shining on the dark wood. The moment the door swung shut behind him, the spell was broken. The room erupted in a furious buzz of whispers. The bartender stormed over and snatched the coin, his face purple with rage. But Alara paid them no mind. She was looking at a table in the far corner, where two men sat watching her, their eyes glittering with a cold, reptilian malice. They were Jeb and Caleb Thorne, the sons of Silas Thorne. Jeb, the elder, was built like his father, thick and powerful, with a brutish face and a permanent smirk of arrogant cruelty. Caleb was leaner, almost weaselly, with shifty eyes that darted around the room, always looking for weakness. They were the princes of this dusty kingdom, and they carried their father's authority like a weapon. They had witnessed the entire exchange. They had seen her defy the unspoken rule of the town. In their twisted view, her act of kindness was not kindness at all. It was a transgression, a betrayal. It was a personal insult to them, to their father, to the order of things. They saw her look of shared understanding with the stranger and interpreted it as something filthy, a secret alliance against them. Jeb leaned forward and spoke to his brother, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "Well now, Caleb, looks like our new girl has a soft spot for red men." Caleb's thin lips twisted into a cruel smile. "She needs to be taught a lesson," he hissed. "She needs to learn who she works for, who owns this town." Jeb's eyes locked on Alara as she turned away to collect her cleaning rag, a cold, predatory gleam in their depths. "Oh, she'll learn," he said, his voice soft with a terrible promise. "She will learn tonight." The hours that followed were the longest of Alara's life. She went about her duties in a daze, the angry whispers and hostile glares of the patrons washing over her. The memory of the stranger's grateful eyes was a small, flickering candle, but the chill from the Thorne brothers' stare was a gathering storm that threatened to extinguish it completely. She worked until the saloon was nearly empty, until the last drunk had been thrown out into the street and the chairs were stacked on the tables. Finally, the bartender grunted at her that she was done. Her hands ached and her feet were sore, but a wave of relief washed over her. She collected her meager pay and slipped out the back door, into the familiar darkness of the service alley. The night air was cooler, and for a moment, she closed her eyes and just breathed, letting the relative quiet soothe her frayed nerves. The alley was a narrow passage between the saloon and the land office, choked with overflowing refuse barrels and smelling of sour mash and decay. Deep shadows clung to the walls, hiding the filth. She took a step toward the street, toward the small, clean room at the boarding house that was her only sanctuary. "In a hurry, little lady?" The voice came from the deepest part of the shadows. Alara froze, her blood turning to ice. Jeb Thorne stepped out, blocking her path. From the other end of the alley, a second figure emerged from the darkness. Caleb. She was trapped. A raw, primal fear seized her, tightening its fist around her heart. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. Jeb chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He took a slow step closer, his bulk seeming to swallow the narrow space. "We saw you today, making eyes at that savage. You think you're better than us? Think you can just spit on our father's rules?" "It was just a glass of water," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "He was thirsty." "He was filth," Caleb spat, his voice sharp and venomous. "And you gave him comfort, made him feel welcome. Seems to me you got a fondness for his kind." He moved closer, circling her like a coyote. "Maybe you're a savage lover, is that it?" The accusation hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Alara shook her head, tears of terror and frustration welling in her eyes. "No, please, I was just—" "You were just what?" Jeb's voice was a menacing growl now. He was right in front of her, his foul, whiskey-laced breath hot on her face. "You were just making us look like fools in our own establishment, and we do not like that." Panic clawed at her throat. She tried to bolt, to run past Caleb, but he was too quick. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. She cried out, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the night. Jeb grabbed her other arm, and they slammed her back against the rough, splintered wood of the saloon wall. Her head cracked against the boards, and the world swam in a haze of stars and pain. She was utterly helpless, pinned between them, their cruel faces leering down at her. "Please," she sobbed, the fight draining out of her. "Please do not—" "Oh, we ain't gonna do what you think," Jeb said with a sickening smile. "We're just gonna give you a reminder, a lesson in loyalty." He looked down, his gaze falling upon her hands, the hands that had poured the water, the hands that scrubbed the floors and earned her keep, the hands that were her only hope for a future. He nodded at Caleb. Understanding passed between them, a cold, methodical purpose. Caleb pinned her shoulders to the wall with his body, his weight crushing the air from her lungs. He took her left wrist in a cruel grip, forcing her arm out, her hand splayed and helpless. Ilara's mind screamed. She thrashed, but it was useless. She saw what was coming. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it stole her breath. Jeb took her hand in his massive, calloused grip. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a cold, dead satisfaction. "You use these hands to serve filth," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "So you will not use them at all." He twisted. A sound tore through the alley, a sickening crack of bone that was louder than her choked scream. A bolt of white-hot, agonizing fire shot up her arm, exploding behind her eyes. The world dissolved into a blinding sheet of pure pain. Through the roaring in her ears, she was dimly aware of Caleb grabbing her other wrist, forcing her right hand out. "This," Jeb snarled, his face contorted with hate as he took her other hand, "is what happens to those who show kindness to his kind." The second crack was her undoing. The pain was absolute, an ocean of agony that drowned her. Her legs gave way, and if they had not been holding her up, she would have collapsed. They held her for a moment longer, savoring their work, before contemptuously dropping her. She landed in a crumpled heap in the dirt and filth of the alley. They loomed over her for a second, two monstrous shadows against the faint starlight, before their footsteps receded, leaving behind only the echo of their cruel laughter. Ilara lay there, broken. The only reality was the all-consuming, throbbing fire in her hands. She curled into herself, cradling the mangled, useless things to her chest, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. The small, hopeful flame that had been lit by a moment of connection in the saloon had been brutally stamped out, leaving her in a darkness more profound and terrifying than any she had ever known. Pain was a country, and Ilara was its sole inhabitant. It had its own geography, a landscape of jagged peaks and fiery rivers, all contained within the ruined architecture of her hands. The world outside that brutal territory had ceased to exist. The alley, the filth, the cold night air, these were distant concepts, drowned out by the screaming symphony of shattered bone and torn nerve. For a long time. How long she did not know. She lay curled in the dirt, a small, broken thing, while the waves of agony washed over her, each one cresting higher than the last. But beneath the pain, another feeling stirred, a cold, stark terror. The alley was not safe. The shadows that had hidden her attackers could hide other things. The thought of them returning, of their leering faces and cruel laughter, was a spur that drove her to move. Survival was a deeply rooted instinct, a stubborn weed that refused to be uprooted even in the most barren soil. She had to get to her room. It was the only sanctuary she had. The journey was a nightmare pilgrimage. She could not use her hands to push herself up, so she writhed onto her side, using her elbows and shoulders to gain some leverage. The movement sent fresh bolts of lightning up her arms, and a black fog swam at the edges of her vision. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting the salt of her own blood. To keep from screaming, sobbing, she dragged herself forward, inch by agonizing inch, out of the alley's suffocating darkness and into the faint starlight of the empty street. The boarding house was only 100 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. She crawled and stumbled, a grotesque parody of a walk, her arms clutched uselessly to her chest. The town was dead to the world, its righteous citizens asleep in their beds, unaware of or untroubled by the violence committed in its dark corners. She reached the steps of the boarding house and stared at them as if they were a mountain range. Using her knees and her back, she managed to haul herself up the 3 wooden steps, each one a fresh torment. The doorknob was a final, impossible challenge. Leaning her full weight against the door, she managed to turn the cold brass knob with the crook of her elbow, the pressure sending a nauseating shockwave through her shattered wrist. Somehow, she was inside. The stairs to the 2nd floor were a new circle of hell. She went up them backward, on her knees, the rough wood scraping her skin raw. By the time she reached the landing, she was slick with sweat and trembling from exhaustion and shock. Her room, the door was ajar. She pushed it open with her shoulder and fell inside, landing in a heap on the floor. With the last of her strength, she kicked the door shut. She was safe, but it was the safety of a tomb. The room was small and sparse, containing only an iron bedstead with a thin mattress, a wooden trunk for her belongings, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. This little room had been her hope. It was the first place in years that had felt like her own. Here, she had allowed herself to dream of a future, a quiet life somewhere far away from the ghosts of her past. Now, that dream lay in ruins, as broken as her hands. She looked at them. In the dim moonlight slanting through the window, she could see the unnatural angles, the grotesque swelling. They were not her hands anymore. They were just objects of pain, her tools for survival, for earning her keep, for building a new life, were gone. A wave of utter, soul-crushing despair washed over her. So vast and cold it was worse than the pain. She had run so far, endured so much, only to be crippled in a place called redemption. The irony was a bitter ash in her mouth. She crawled to the bed, dragged herself onto it, and surrendered to the darkness. Miles away, in the scrub-covered hills that formed a jagged rim around the basin of Redemption Gulch, Ethan Blackwood sat by a small, smokeless fire, the Coyote Fire, his uncle had called it. Just a handful of glowing embers in a shallow pit, enough to give warmth but not light or smoke to betray a man's position. His mare, tethered nearby, grazed peacefully on a patch of dry grass. The immense, star-dusted canopy of the night sky stretched out above him, a silent, indifferent cathedral. This was where he was most at home, in the vast quiet of the wilderness, far from the suffocating judgment of towns. But tonight, the familiar peace of the wild eluded him. A strange and persistent unease coiled in his gut like a cold snake. He told himself it was nothing, just the lingering tension of his visit to the town. But he knew it was more than that. He was a man who had survived by listening to the subtle warnings of his instincts. And right now, They were screaming at him. He kept replaying the scene in the saloon, not the moment he had looked into the woman's eyes. That memory was a small, warm coal he kept shielded in his heart. He focused on what came after, the look on the faces of the Thorne brothers. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of hungry wolves and cornered rattlesnakes. It was not just anger. It was a possessive, predatory cruelty, a deep-seated malice that found pleasure in the suffering of others. They had seen her simple act of kindness as a defiance of their power, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that such men would not let that defiance go unanswered. He thought of her, Ilara. He had heard the bartender spit her name with contempt after she had served him. He remembered the weariness in her posture, but the stubborn courage in her gaze. She did not belong in a place like that. It was a kindness too fragile for such a brutal world. It was a foolish, dangerous kindness, and he had been its recipient. That made him responsible. The thought was unwelcome, an entanglement he had spent his life avoiding. It was not his concern. He had his own way to make, his own ghosts to outrun. He had learned the hard way that caring for anyone was a liability in a world that saw him as less than human. He lay back on his bedroll, pulling his blanket up against the night's chill, and stared up at the unblinking stars. He tried to force the town, the saloon, the woman from his mind. But the image of the Thorne brothers' venomous glares was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The unease would not leave him. It was a living thing, a protective instinct he had not felt for another soul since his mother had died. He knew he would not sleep. He knew he would not find peace until he knew for certain that she was safe. With a low curse, he sat up. He could not leave it be. Kicking dirt over the embers of his fire, he rose and went to his mare. Her soft knicker was a question. "Just a feeling," he murmured, stroking her neck as he tightened the cinch on her saddle. He swung up onto her back and turned her nose back toward the hateful glow of Redemption Gulch, moving through the darkness like a ghost, a silent hunter drawn by a premonition of violence. He did not ride into the town, but circled it, approaching from the dark, empty plains at its rear. He tethered his horse in a thicket of mesquite and slipped forward on foot, his movements as fluid and silent as the night wind. He was no longer the weary traveler who had ridden in for supplies. He was Kavi, the tracker, the man who could read the land and the secrets it held. He made his way to the back of the saloon, melting into the deep shadows of the alley. His senses were on fire. He smelled the sour stench of spilled whiskey and rot. He saw the deep shadows, the chaos of discarded crates and barrels, and then he saw the story written in the dust. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, picked out the signs immediately. The scuffed earth near the wall, the deep, frantic gouges that spoke of a desperate struggle. He knelt, his fingers hovering over the disturbed ground. He saw the faint outline of a body, where someone had fallen, and then he saw it. A few dark, rust-colored drops, almost black in the moonlight, soaking into the pale, thirsty dirt, blood. The cold snake in his gut tightened into a knot of ice. His unease had not been a premonition. It had been an echo. He had been too late. Standing slowly, his eyes scanned the ground, piecing together the grim narrative. He found the faint trail leading away from the site of the struggle, the pathetic drag marks of someone crawling, a smear of blood on the edge of a wooden crate, the unsteady prints of someone trying to walk while grievously injured. The trail was weak, almost non-existent, but to his trained eyes, it was as clear as a map. It led him out of the alley and across the street to the boarding house. The front door was unlatched. He pushed it open and slipped inside, a shadow detaching itself from the night. The air in the house was stale and still. The only sound, the loud, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the parlor, marking time in a house where time had run out for someone. He stood motionless, listening, his entire being straining to catch the slightest sound, and then he heard it, faint, coming from the floor above. It was the sound of weeping, so quiet, and choked with pain, it was almost imperceptible. It was the sound of a creature trying to suffer without alerting its predators. He moved toward the stairs, his moccasined feet making no sound on the worn floorboards. He took the stairs one at a time, testing each one for a creak before putting his weight on it. He reached the upper landing and followed the sound to a door at the far end of the hall. He pressed his ear to the cheap pine wood. The sound was clearer now. A woman's muffled sob. A raw, desperate sound of pure agony that twisted something deep inside him. He did not hesitate. His hand closed around the cold brass knob, and he pushed the door open. The room was bathed in a weak, silvery moonlight that did little to dispel the gloom. He saw a figure huddled on the simple iron bed, trembling so violently the frame rattled. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, the details sharpened into a vision of horror. The figure was Elara. Her body was curled into a tight ball of misery, and her hands were wrapped in what looked like torn strips from a bedsheet, now stained dark and stiff with dried blood. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs, leaving a hollow ache in his chest, a cold, visceral horror, sharp and sickening, rose in his throat. She must have sensed his presence, a large, dark shape filling her doorway. A terrified whimper escaped her lips, and she scrambled backward on the bed, trying to press herself into the wall. "No," she breathed, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Please, leave me be." In her pain-shattered mind, he was not a person but a symbol, the cause of her torment. His face was the reason her hands were broken. Ethan raised his own hands slowly, palms out, showing they were empty, that they meant no harm. "I will not hurt you," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, a sound meant to soothe a frightened animal. He took a slow step into the room, moving into the sliver of moonlight so she could see his face. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and pain, but as she saw his expression, her terror began to falter. This was not the face of a monster. The stoic mask he had worn in the saloon was gone. In its place was an expression of such raw, naked anguish, such profound horror and self-recrimination, that it mirrored her own suffering. He was not here to inflict more pain. He was drowning in it himself. Seeing the genuine torment in his eyes, the last of her defenses crumbled. The dam of her restraint, which she had held in place with every ounce of her will, finally broke. A great, shuddering sob tore through her, a sound of pure, undiluted agony that seemed to rip her apart from the inside. He moved to the side of the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not touch her. He did not know how. He simply stood there, a helpless witness, his gaze fixed on her ruined hands. His face was a canvas of guilt and a rage so cold and profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Through her racking sobs, she forced out the words, the terrible justification her attackers had given her, the words they had beaten into her soul. "They broke my hands," she choked, the confession tearing at her throat. They said it was for serving you." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He flinched as if he had been shot, his carefully constructed stoicism, the armor of indifference he had worn for a lifetime, shattered into a million pieces. It was true. He was the cause. His presence, his thirst, his simple existence had brought this horror crashing down on her. The world's blind hatred for his Comanche blood had found a new target, an innocent woman whose only crime had been a moment of decency. The guilt was a suffocating wave, pulling him under. But beneath it, a different emotion began to crystallize, hardening into something unbreakable. It was a silent, glacial fury, a promise of retribution so deep and cold it needed no voice. In that instant, a single, absolute certainty formed in his mind. Leaving her here was not an option. It was a death sentence. The Thorns had done this to make a point, and her brokenness would serve as their trophy. They would not allow her to heal. They would not allow her to leave. She would waste away in this room, unable to work, unable to feed herself, until she simply faded away. He had to get her out. His decision was swift and irreversible. He would take her with him. He would take her somewhere safe, somewhere the thorns' poison could not reach. He did not know where. He did not know how, but he knew he would. His paralysis broke. He moved with a quiet purpose, his touch surprisingly gentle. He found the wash basin and the pitcher. The water was stale, but it would have to do. He found a clean scrap of cloth in her trunk. He sat on the edge of the bed, and this time, she did not flinch away. He began to work, his large, calloused hands moving with an incredible delicacy as he soaked the cloth and began to gently soften the dried blood on the rags around her hands. Every time she whimpered in pain, it was a fresh knife twisting in his gut. When he had cleaned them as best he could, he told her his plan, his voice low and steady, a rock in her sea of pain. "I am taking you from this place. I will take you somewhere you can heal." He went downstairs, his mind racing. He found the landlady's room and knocked. When the fussy, night-gowned woman opened the door, he put on a mask of calm, neighborly concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "The young woman in the end room, Ilara, she has a terrible fever. I think she fell and hurt her hands badly. I am going to fetch the doctor." He pressed the silver dollar from the saloon into her palm. "This is for her rent and for your trouble." The lie, delivered with conviction, and the weight of the silver, worked. The woman's suspicion melted into greedy solicitude. She urged him to hurry and scurried back into her room, locking the door behind her. He returned to Ilara. Gathering her meager belongings was an agonizing process. He found her small wooden trunk and packed the few items she owned: a spare dress of faded calico, a silver-backed brush, a small, worn book of poetry. Every object he touched felt like a testament to the life that had been stolen from her, and it fueled the cold fire of his rage. Then came the hardest part. He had to help her dress in warmer clothes for the journey. The forced intimacy of it was excruciating for them both. He had to lift her arms, guide them into the sleeves of a woolen shawl, his touch as gentle as he could make it. Her body was stiff and trembling, and her soft cries of pain were a constant, shared burden between them. Finally, she was ready. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they made their way down the stairs and out into the dead of night. He lifted her onto his mare, the horse shifting patiently under the unfamiliar load. He settled Ilara in front of the saddle, her small frame fragile against his chest. He swung up behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist to hold her steady. Her body was rigid with pain, but she leaned back against him, a silent admission of trust. He urged the horse forward, and they moved away from the sleeping town. Two broken figures seeking refuge in the darkness. They melted into the vast, indifferent wilderness that stretched out before them, a place of unknown dangers that now had to become their sanctuary. The journey ahead was a terrifying uncertainty, but the hell they were leaving behind was absolute. The first hours of their flight were a fever dream. Ilara drifted in and out of a gray, hazy world where the only constants were the rhythmic sway of the horse and the searing fire in her hands. She was dimly aware of a steady arm around her waist, a solid presence at her back that kept her from falling. At times, the pain would recede, replaced by a burning heat that consumed her from within, and she would murmur nonsensical words into the darkness, fragments of memory and fear. Through it all, Ethan pushed onward, his face a grim mask of determination. He drove the mare relentlessly through the night, seeking the broken, trackless country to the west. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering little light. He navigated by the stars and by an instinct born of a lifetime spent under their silent watch. The landscape they entered was a formidable enemy, a maze of deep-cut arroyos, jagged rock formations, and arid plains sparsely dotted with skeletal mesquite and yucca that clawed at them as they passed. The land was hostile, designed to kill the weak and the careless. But Ethan was neither. He knew its secrets. He knew the game trails that were invisible to most eyes, the dry washes that offered the softest footing, the canyons that could hide an army. His profound knowledge of this brutal world was their only shield. When the eastern sky began to bleed with the first faint colors of dawn, he finally allowed them to rest. He found a shallow overhang of rock that offered some concealment and gently eased Alara from the horse. She was limp in his arms, her skin radiating a dry, dangerous heat. Her fever was climbing. He gave her a few sips of water from his canteen, which she took with a barely conscious thirst. He sat with his back against the rock, holding her as she shivered despite the growing warmth of the day, his rifle across his lap, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. He did not sleep. For 2 days, they traveled like this. He moved by night and hid by day, pushing them deeper into the desolate heart of the wilderness. Alara's condition worsened. The fever held her in its grip, and she grew weaker, her periods of consciousness becoming shorter and more confused. He knew he could not keep this pace. She needed more than concealment and sips of water. She needed a place to rest, a place to heal. She needed a sanctuary. On the 3rd night, he found it. He had been following a dry creek bed that wound its way into a narrow box canyon. The air grew cooler, and he could smell the faint, life-giving scent of water and damp earth. He urged the tired horse forward, and the sound grew from a distant whisper to a steady murmur. He rounded a final bend, and there it was, a sheet of water, shimmering like a silver curtain in the moonlight, spilled over a high rock ledge and into a deep, clear pool below. The waterfall was not large, but in this parched land, it was a miracle. It was life. But the true gift was hidden. To the side of the falls, almost completely obscured by the cascading water and a thick growth of ferns, was a dark opening in the rock face. Dismounting, Ethan tied the horse and waded into the shallow edge of the pool. He pushed through the cool, misty spray and stepped into the opening. It was not a deep cave, but a wide, dry alcove, its floor covered in soft sand. It was secluded, defensible, and had a source of fresh water. It was a haven. He brought Alara inside, laying her gently on his bedroll in the driest part of the shelter. The air was cool and smelled of wet stone and green things. The steady, rhythmic sound of the waterfall was a soothing balm, a world away from the harsh silence of the desert. He had brought them to a small pocket of life, a secret garden hidden in a world of stone. Here, she could begin to recover. Here, he could begin the real work. His care for her was a meticulous, unending ritual. He moved with a quiet competence that belied the urgency he felt. His first task was to fight the fever that was consuming her. He left her sleeping and ventured out, his eyes scanning the terrain not for threats, but for the subtle signs of the remedies his mother had taught him. He found a patch of yarrow growing in a sunny spot and gathered its feathery leaves. Near the water, he found the broad, soft leaves of a plant he knew would draw out heat. Back in the alcove, he crushed the herbs between 2 smooth stones, mixing them with a little cool water to make a green, fragrant poultice. He gently unwrapped the bloody rags from her hands, his touch as light as a breath. The sight of them, swollen, discolored, and twisted into unnatural shapes, sent a fresh wave of guilt and fury through him. He cleansed them as best he could before applying the cool poultice to her forehead and her wrists. He sat by her side for hours, changing the dressings as they grew warm, his entire being focused on this one simple task, to draw the fire out of her. For the pain, he sought out the willow trees that grew along the edge of the pool. He stripped away sections of the bark, knowing that within it lay a medicine that could ease her suffering. He brewed a bitter tea over a small, smokeless fire, and when it had cooled, he gently coaxed her into consciousness, lifting her head and helping her drink the liquid. It was a slow, painstaking process, but she drank, her trust in him so absolute it was a physical weight on his soul. Slowly, miraculously, the remedies began to work. After a day and a night, her fever broke. The unnatural heat receded, leaving her pale and weak, but her skin was cool to the touch. She slept a deep, natural sleep for the first time since the attack. Ethan watched her, a profound sense of relief washing over him. But he knew the worst was yet to come. The fever had been a fire he could fight. What came next was a mountain he had to move. Her bones, they were broken, and if they were not set properly, she would never have the use of her hands again. The thought was unbearable. He waited until she was awake and lucid, her eyes clear, though clouded with pain and exhaustion. He sat before her, his expression grave. He had to explain, and the words felt like stones in his mouth. "Elara," he began, his voice low and steady. "The fever is gone, but your hands, the bones are broken badly." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If they heal as they are, you will have no strength in them. They will be crippled for good." She looked down at her bandaged hands, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "What can be done?" she whispered, her voice fragile. This was the hardest part. "They need to be set," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The bones need to be put back in their proper place so they can mend straight." He did not soften the next words. "It will hurt, more than you can imagine, but it is the only chance you have." She stared at him, her eyes searching his. She saw no cruelty there, no malice. She saw only a deep, shared sorrow and a grim resolve. She saw a man willing to inflict terrible pain, not out of hate, but as an act of desperate hope. In that moment, she understood the depth of his character. This man, this supposed savage, was offering her a future, even if the price was a moment of unimaginable agony. The trust she had placed in him on that dark night in her room solidified into something unbreakable, an anchor in the storm of her pain. She took a shaky breath and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Do it," she whispered. The scene that followed was an intimate agony. He prepared as best he could, tearing strips of his own shirt for new bandages and gathering splints from the straight, hard branches of a greasewood bush. He made her lie down, her head resting on a folded blanket. He knelt beside her, taking her left hand in his. It felt small and fragile, a bird with a broken wing. "I am sorry for this," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He worked quickly, his touch firm and precise. He closed his eyes for a second, picturing the bones as his mother had shown him on injured animals, feeling for the breaks, the misalignments. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled. A scream tore from Elara's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed off the rock walls of the alcove, a sound that he felt in the marrow of his own bones. Her body arched in a spasm of pain, and he held her steady, his face a mask of torment. There was a faint, sickening grate as the bone shifted into place. He immediately bound it tight with the splints and bandages, his movements swift and sure. He did not let go until he was done. He repeated the process on her other hand, and her scream, though weaker, was just as sharp, a blade that cut him to the soul. When it was over, she lay limp and trembling, her face chalk white and bathed in a cold sweat. Sobs shook her small frame, but they were silent, exhausted things. He knelt beside her, his head bowed, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. He had inflicted this. He had been the instrument of her torment, even in the service of healing. Then he felt a faint touch on his arm. He looked up. Through her tears, she was looking at him, and her eyes held not fear or accusation, but a deep, profound gratitude. She had seen the pain in his face, had felt his own trembling as he held her. She knew what this had cost him. The bond between them, forged in violence and flight, was now sealed in shared suffering and an impossible trust. From that day forward, something fundamental shifted between them. As Elara slowly began to recover, Her perception of Ethan transformed completely. The man the world saw, the silent, dangerous half-breed, simply ceased to exist for her. She saw him instead through the lens of their shared sanctuary. She watched his hands, the same hands that had caused her such agony, as they moved with surprising gentleness, tending the fire, preparing their simple meals, dressing her injuries. She watched his quiet competence, the way he read the landscape, the way he moved with such purpose and grace. She saw the profound sadness that lived deep in his dark eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. The savage of Redemption Gulch's prejudice dissolved, replaced by the image of a profoundly decent man, a man of quiet strength and deep compassion. Her gratitude, already immense, began to blossom into a tender, hesitant affection, an admiration for the man he was, not the man the world judged him to be. For Ethan, caring for her became a ritual of atonement. Each small act of service was a prayer for her forgiveness, a way to pay the debt he felt he owed her. In the quiet hours of her recovery, he found a purpose that went beyond mere survival. He was not just keeping himself alive. He was nurturing another life back to health. It gave him a reason to hunt, to forage, to watch over their small haven with a fierce, protective vigilance. Their forced intimacy, born of her complete physical dependency, stripped away all pretense. He had to feed her, holding a spoon of broth to her lips. He had to help her drink, cradling her head in the crook of his arm. These moments of profound vulnerability were a bridge between their two solitudes. In the quiet of the evenings, with only the sound of the waterfall and the crackle of the fire for company, they began to talk. He spoke of his past in broken fragments, sharing pieces of a life he had never spoken of to anyone. He told her of his white father, a trapper who had taken a Comanche wife and then abandoned her and their son when he decided to return to a more civilized world. He spoke of the rejection he faced in that world, the taunts and the hatred. He also spoke of the isolation he felt among his mother's people. He was not fully Comanche in their eyes, his father's blood a permanent stain that set him apart. He was Kavi, the coyote, a creature of the borders, belonging nowhere. Hearing the pain of his loneliness, Ilara found the courage to share her own. She spoke of her family, lost to sickness back east, and of a disastrous marriage to a man whose kindness had been a mask for a cruel and controlling nature. She had run from him, seeking not just safety, but a place where she could be her own person, beholden to no one. They were two outcasts, two souls scarred by the world, finding a strange and unexpected solace in one another. Back in Redemption Gulch, Silas Thorne was a man consumed by a cold, black rage. He stood behind the bar in his own saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes like chips of flint. The boarding house owner had come to him that morning, babbling about a fever and a doctor who never arrived. A quick search of Ilara's empty room and the talk from the stable hand about the half-breed's horse being gone all night painted a clear picture. She had not just vanished. She had fled with the savage. To Thorne, this was not a simple matter of a missing saloon girl. It was a public and profound act of defiance. The breed had come into his town, been the cause of trouble, and had now brazenly stolen property from under his very nose. In Thorne's mind, Ilara was little more than that, property, an employee, a piece of his domain. For her to choose to leave with an outcast like Blackwood was an intolerable insult to his authority, a challenge to the very foundation of his power. He walked out onto the saloon's porch, his face a thundercloud. The townspeople, sensing the shift in the wind, fell silent, watching him. "That savage, Blackwood!" Thorne's voice boomed, carrying across the dusty street. "He came into our town, and last night, he crept back in like the snake he is. He has taken the girl, Ilara, stolen a decent white woman from her bed." The lie was bald and venomous, but it was a lie the people of Redemption Gulch were eager to believe. It confirmed their every prejudice, stoked their deepest fears. A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. "He has defied our laws and our decency," Thorne roared, his voice rising with righteous fury. "He has taken what is ours, and we will not stand for it. This is not just about one girl. This is about our homes, our families, our safety. Are we to let a wild animal roam free, preying on our women?" "No!" a voice shouted from the crowd, and others took up the cry. The personal vendetta of a tyrannical cattle baron had been transformed, in a matter of moments, into a holy crusade. Thorn had turned his rage into their rage, his insult into their fear. He turned his gaze to his sons, Jeb and Caleb, who stood on the edge of the crowd, their faces alight with a cruel eagerness. "Get a posse," Silas Thorn commanded, his voice dropping to a low, deadly command. "I want him found. I want him dragged back here in chains, and I want the girl brought back. I will show them both what happens to those who defy the laws of Redemption Gulch. I want you to hunt them down." Jeb's brutal face split into a grin. He and Caleb had a personal score to settle with the man who had made them look foolish. This was not justice. This was an excuse for a kill. Within the hour, a dozen men, fueled by whiskey and self-righteous hatred, were mounted and armed. They rode out of town with Jeb and Caleb Thorn at their head, a grim procession of vigilante justice, their faces set toward the desolate wilderness to the west. The hunt had begun. The peace in their hidden sanctuary was a fragile, precious thing. In the weeks that followed the agony of setting her bones, Elara's hands began to mend. The fierce, throbbing pain subsided into a dull, constant ache, and she slowly regained a small measure of strength. They fell into a quiet rhythm, a domesticity that felt both natural and miraculous. He would hunt and forage, and she would tend the fire, learning to manage the small tasks with her bandaged, clumsy hands. The quiet of the alcove, with the constant music of the waterfall, was a healing balm for them both, a world removed from the hate and violence they had fled. But Ethan never truly relaxed. He was a creature of the wilderness, and his senses were always alert, a fine-tuned instrument constantly reading the wind, the sky, the subtle language of the earth. The first sign of danger was not a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a wrongness that prickled the back of his neck. Then came the evidence, things a less practiced eye would never have noticed. A faint column of dust on the distant horizon, too disciplined and persistent to be stirred by the wind alone. A single, overturned stone on a high ridge, a pale scar against the darker rock, where no animal would have dislodged it. A cold dread settled in his gut. They had been found, or rather, they were being hunted. He did not tell Elara. She was still fragile, her spirit just beginning to knit itself back together, and he would not shatter her newfound peace with the terror he felt coiled inside him. He kept the knowledge locked behind a mask of calm, but the change in him was undeniable. His quietness became a deeper, more profound silence. His eyes, always watchful, now scanned the ridges and canyons with a new, grim intensity. He began to sleep in shorter, lighter shifts, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. Elara noticed the change. The easy rhythm they had found was gone, replaced by a tense, thrumming energy that radiated from him. One evening, as he stood at the mouth of their alcove, staring out into the twilight, she came to stand beside him. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked softly, her voice still raspy from disuse. "What troubles you?" He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Nothing," he lied, his voice tight. "A mountain lion has been scenting the area. We just need to be watchful." She knew it was a lie. A mountain lion would not put that look of cold, hard certainty in his eyes. It was men he was watching for. The men from Redemption Gulch. The fear she had managed to keep at bay returned, a cold hand gripping her heart. But she did not press him. She simply nodded, accepting the protection his lie offered, and stood beside him in silence as the darkness gathered around them. 2 days later, he came to her, his face set like stone. "We have to leave," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is not safe here any longer." He began to pack their few belongings with a swift, economical urgency. And the brief, beautiful chapter of their life behind the waterfall came to an end. They moved north, into a country even more brutal and unforgiving. Their journey became a tense and desperate game of cat and mouse. Ethan was the mouse, but a mouse who knew every crack and crevice in the floorboards, while the cat was a clumsy, lumbering beast. He was their guide, their protector, their only hope. He led them over vast stretches of solid rock, a sun-baked tableland where their horses' hooves would leave no tracks. He doubled back on their trail, laying false paths that led to impassable cliffs or waterless wastes. He would ride for miles in the bed of a shallow, rocky stream, the water washing away their scent and their prints, a trick his mother's people had used for generations. He moved when he knew the posse would be resting, in the brutal heat of midday, and he found them shelter when he knew the posse would be on the move. In the cooler hours of the morning and evening, he was a ghost, a shadow on the land, and Alara could only watch in awe and terror as he pitted his wits and his knowledge against the faceless, relentless pursuit. They had several close calls, moments when survival hung by a thread as thin as a spider's silk. Once, they were scaling a narrow game trail on the side of a steep mesa when he suddenly froze. He pulled her and their horses into a deep fissure in the rock, his hand clamped over his mare's muzzle to keep her from whinnying. They waited, their bodies pressed together in the tight space. Minutes later, the posse rode by on the canyon floor below them. They were so close Alara could hear the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle, the coarse, rumbling laughter of the men. She heard Jeb Thorne's booming voice cursing the heat and the futility of the chase. The sound of it, the voice of her tormentor, sent a wave of nausea and terror through her. She pressed her face into Ethan's back, her body trembling uncontrollably, until the sounds faded into the distance. He held them there for a long time after, his body a rigid shield between her and the world, his heart hammering a frantic, silent rhythm against her cheek. The sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for days, began to turn against them. It started with a change in the wind, a sudden cool breath in the stifling heat. Then the horizon to the west darkened, bruised to a sickly shade of purple and gray. The clouds piled upon one another, building into a towering thunderhead, an anvil of the gods. Ethan urged their horses on, his eyes scanning the landscape for shelter. A sudden, violent thunderstorm was brewing, a force of nature that could be as deadly as any posse, but one that might also be their salvation. The rain would wash their tracks away. The first drops were fat and warm, spattering in the dust like scattered coins. Then the wind hit them, a furious gale that tore at their clothes and filled the air with stinging sand. The sky opened up, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to split the very rock beneath their feet. A fork of brilliant, blue-white lightning lit up the landscape, revealing a world of violent, chaotic motion. Just as the deluge hit, Ethan found what he was looking for, a shallow cave carved into the base of a sandstone cliff, its mouth a dark, gaping maw. He hurried them inside, pulling the horses in after them just as the full fury of the storm broke. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos of wind and water. It was as if the earth itself were being torn apart. But inside their small shelter, there was a strange and profound peace. The cave was not deep, but it was dry. The roar of the storm was muffled, a distant, elemental rage. They were trapped, but they were safe. The constant, gnawing fear of the posse was temporarily silenced, drowned out by the much greater power of the storm. They stood together near the mouth of the cave, watching the awesome, terrifying spectacle. The air inside the cave was charged, the emotional intensity that had been building between them for days finally reaching its breaking point. They had been hunted. They had been terrified. They had stared death in the face. And yet they were still here. They were alive, together, against all odds. The sheer, overwhelming relief of it was a palpable thing. Ethan turned to look at her. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, stark and beautiful in the gloom. He saw the streaks of rain on her cheeks, the wildness in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw not a weak, broken victim, but a survivor, a woman of incredible, resilient strength. The admiration and affection he had tried to suppress, to keep buried under layers of guilt and responsibility, rose to the surface, powerful and undeniable. He lifted a hand, his touch shockingly gentle, and brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered for a moment on the line of her jaw. The world outside roared, but in the small, still space between them, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the trust, the same unquestioning trust she had given him when he held her broken hands in his. He leaned in, and his name was a prayer on her lips. Ethan. He kissed her. It was not a soft or tender kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation and relief, of shared trauma and a fierce, defiant will to live. It was a desperate affirmation of life and love against a world that seemed determined to crush them. His lips were hard and demanding, and she met his kiss with an equal, surprising fervor. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and dust and fear, but beneath it all was a current of profound, aching tenderness. In that moment, pressed together in the heart of the storm, they were not a hunter and a victim, not a protector and his ward. They were just a man and a woman, finding a temporary, passionate sanctuary in each other's arms. The storm eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and unnervingly quiet. The rain had erased their trail, buying them precious time. But Ethan knew it was not over. The posse was made of drunken, disinterested men who would likely give up. But Jeb and Caleb were a different matter. They were not just following orders. They were driven by a personal, venomous hatred. They would not give up so easily, and they were better trackers than the rest. His fears were realized the next afternoon. From a high vantage point, he saw them. A group of riders, much smaller than the original posse, was doggedly working their way through the washed-out terrain. He recognized the bulky form of Jeb Thorne in the lead. They were closing the distance. He made a decision, a terrible, dangerous gamble. The main body of the posse was clumsy, their tracking skills mediocre. He could lead them on a chase they would never forget, but he had to get them away from Alara. He turned to her, his face grim. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They are close, too close. I am going to lead them away. There is a box canyon south of here, a maze of stone. I can lose them in there for a day, maybe more." Her eyes widened in fear. "You cannot," she whispered. "They will kill you." "They have to catch me first," he said, a flicker of a grim smile touching his lips. He gripped her shoulders. "You must stay here. This thicket of boulders. It will hide you well. Do not move. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Not until I come back for you. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Their parting was a thing of terrible, unspoken words. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes memorizing her face. Then he swung onto his horse. He rode to the edge of the ridge, deliberately showing himself against the skyline for a brief moment, a clear and taunting invitation. Then he spurred his horse into a gallop, heading directly for the treacherous mouth of the box canyon. He heard the triumphant shouts behind him. The ruse had worked. The main posse, seeing their quarry, gave chase with a renewed, bloodthirsty vigor. Ethan led them deep into the twisting, dead-end labyrinth of stone, his skilled horsemanship allowing him to navigate turns and drops that slowed his pursuers to a frustrated crawl. He had trapped them, just as he had planned. It took him hours to safely double back, using a high, narrow sheep trail that the posse would never find. As he rode, a gnawing anxiety grew in his chest. He had been away from her for too long. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon when he finally reached the thicket of boulders where he had left her. She was gone. For a moment, his world stopped. The silence of the empty hiding spot was a deafening roar in his ears. He leaped from his horse, his heart plummeting into a cold, dark abyss of dread. He frantically searched for signs. He found them. The earth was scuffed and gouged, the clear marks of a desperate struggle. A small, wooden button from her dress lay half buried in the dirt, and alongside the faint marks of her worn boots were two other sets of prints, larger and deeper. Jeb and Caleb. His gamble had failed. The brothers must have separated from the main group, using their superior tracking skills to circle around, anticipating his plan. A cold, killing rage, unlike anything he had ever known, washed through him. He followed their tracks, his movements now swift and silent, the movements of a predator. He was no longer the hunted, he was the hunter. The trail led him out of the rocks and toward a small, open clearing a quarter of a mile away. He slowed, dismounting and creeping forward, his rifle held ready. He peered through a screen of dusty juniper bushes and saw them. The sight stole the breath from his lungs and turned the rage in his veins to ice. Jeb and Caleb were in the center of the clearing, their horses standing nearby. And they had Alara. She stood between them, her face a pale, frozen mask of terror. A coarse hemp rope was draped loosely around her neck, the end of it held casually in Caleb's hand. She was bait. They were waiting for him. Jeb's cruel face was alight with triumphant cruelty. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the twilight. "Come on out, Blackwood. We know you are there. We got your little savage lover here. She's missed you." Ethan remained frozen, his mind racing. He was outnumbered. A direct assault would be suicide. They would kill her before he could get a clear shot. Caleb gave the rope a cruel tug, making Alara stumble and gasp. "You better show yourself," he screeched, his voice high and thin with malice. "Or we are going to get tired of waiting. We can think of all sorts of fun things to do with her before we string her up." Their taunts were a poison, designed to break him, to force him into a reckless mistake. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to fight, to charge into that clearing and unleash the murderous rage that was consuming him. He wanted to see their blood on the dust. He wanted to hear them scream as he had heard Alara scream. But then he looked at her face. He saw the sheer, soul-deep terror in her eyes, the silent, desperate plea. He knew, with an absolute and devastating certainty, that any move he made, any act of violence, would mean her immediate death. They would kill her out of pure spite. Her life was more important than his vengeance. Her life was more important than his freedom, his pride, his own survival. In that terrible, clarifying moment, he knew what he had to do. Slowly, his movements stiff and agonizing, he stepped out from behind the cover of the juniper bushes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his face a hard, unreadable mask. Jeb's smile widened. "There he is. I knew he would not abandon his pet." Ethan looked past them, his eyes locking with Alara's. He tried to convey a world of apology, of reassurance, of a love he had only just admitted to himself. His internal struggle was a war, every instinct for self-preservation, for battle, for revenge, warring against the single, overwhelming need to keep her safe. It was a war he had to lose. In an act of ultimate sacrifice, an act that went against the very core of his being, he slowly, deliberately, lowered the barrel of his rifle until it pointed at the ground. He opened his fingers and let the weapon, his only means of defense, fall into the dust with a soft thud. Then, he raised his empty hands, palms forward, in the universal sign of surrender. The fight was over. He had chosen her life over his own. Ethan's surrender was an act of love, and it was met with an act of pure, unadulterated hate. The moment his hands were raised, Jeb and Caleb charged across the clearing, their faces contorted in a mask of triumphant rage. They fell upon him like wolves on a crippled deer. The first blow, the butt of Jeb's rifle to the side of his head, sent him crashing to his knees, the world exploding in a shower of white-hot stars. From a few yards away, Alara screamed, a raw, ragged sound of horror. Caleb backhanded her across the face, silencing her, forcing her to watch. "You watch," he snarled, his eyes glittering. "You watch what we do to your savage." They did not hold back. They kicked and punched with a frenzied, brutal efficiency. Their victory sealed not by courage, but by the simple fact that their opponent would not fight back. They vented all their frustration, all their petty hatreds, all their festering inadequacies onto his unresisting body. Alara could only watch in mute, horrified disbelief as the man who had shown her such tenderness, the man who had saved her, was beaten into a bloody, unconscious heap in the dust. His sacrifice for her was being repaid with this sickening, cowardly display. The brothers stood over him, chests heaving, their knuckles bloody, their faces flushed with a vile satisfaction. Their victory complete, they bound his hands and feet with a cruel tightness, the ropes cutting deep into his flesh. With a grunt of effort, they hauled his limp body up and unceremoniously slung him face down over the saddle of his own horse. Like a freshly killed buck, Caleb retook the rope from Alara's neck, though he now held it as a simple lead, and pulled her toward her own mount. The grim journey back to Redemption Gulch had begun. The other members of the posse, drawn by the sounds of the confrontation, rejoined them. They were a rough, sullen group, but even some of them looked uneasy at the brutalized, unconscious state of their prisoner. The Thorne brothers, however, were in their element. They rode on either side of Alara, their cruelty now a casual, conversational thing. They taunted her, their words dripping with venom, twisting the memory of her time with Ethan into something sordid and ugly. They deliberately jostled the horse carrying Ethan's unconscious form, taking a sick pleasure in the painful lurching of his body. For the first few hours, Alara rode in a silent, terrified daze. The shock of the capture and the horror of the beating had numbed her, but as the miles wore on, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar feeling. It was rage, a deep, crystalline fury that burned away her fear. She had spent her life being silent, being a victim. She had run from a cruel husband. She had hidden herself in the shadows of the saloon. She had cowered before these very men in a dark alley. But something had changed in her. Ethan's sacrifice, his quiet strength, his unwavering decency, it had given her a strength of her own. She looked at the smirking, brutish faces of Jeb and Caleb, and she was no longer afraid. She was disgusted. "You are cowards," she said, her voice low and clear, cutting through Jeb's latest taunt. He looked at her, surprised. "What did you say, girl?" "I said you are cowards," she repeated, her voice louder now, steadier. She met his gaze without flinching. "The two of you, and all your friends. It takes a dozen men to hunt down one. It takes two of you to beat a man who has surrendered. You are not strong. You are pathetic." A dark flush crept up Jeb's thick neck. "You better shut your mouth." "Why?" she shot back, her voice ringing with contempt. "Are you afraid of a woman's words? You were certainly brave enough with your fists when he could not fight back. You call him a savage, but he is more of a man than either of you will ever be. He is decent and he is brave. You are nothing but bullies and brutes who hide behind your father's name." Her words struck home. Caleb's face went white with fury, and he raised his hand to strike her again, but Jeb stopped him. "Leave her," he growled, though his eyes burned with a new, colder hatred for her. "She can talk all she wants. She will be singing a different tune when she sees her precious savage swinging from a rope." They made camp that night in a shallow, rocky basin, The posse, their spirits high, broke out the whiskey and started a large, roaring fire, the celebration of their victory already beginning. Ethan was cut down from his horse and dumped unceremoniously on the hard ground near the edge of the firelight, his bonds still tight. Alara was tied to a wagon wheel, forced to sit and watch the drunken revelry. Ethan was not unconscious. He had drifted back to a state of hazy, agonizing awareness an hour before, but he kept his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and even. Through the fog of pain that enveloped him, one clear, cold thought remained. Alara. He had to save her. Surrender had not been the end. It had only been a different strategy. He lay perfectly still, listening to the drunken boasts of the posse, the talk of the hero's welcome that awaited them, the eager descriptions of the hanging that Silas Thorne would surely provide. Pain was his anchor. It kept him from drifting away. His head throbbed with a deep, percussive rhythm, and every breath was a fire in his ribs, but he focused past it. As he lay there, a sharp pressure in his back caught his attention. He shifted slightly, a barely perceptible movement that he masked with a low groan. It was a stone. He worked it with his shoulder blades, feeling its edges. It was flat and sharp, flint. And so his own desperate plan began to form. While the posse grew louder and drunker, Ethan began his secret, agonizing work. He lay on his back, his bound hands hidden beneath him. He began to rub the thick rope that bound his wrists against the sharp edge of the flint. The movement was tiny, a fraction of an inch back and forth, a movement that would be invisible in the flickering firelight and deep shadows. It was painstaking, torturous labor. Each tiny movement sent a jolt of pain through his battered body. His muscles screamed in protest. Minutes bled into hours. The fire died down to a bed of glowing coals, one by one. The drunken men of the posse rolled into their blankets and fell into a stupor. He kept working, his mind a fortress of pure will. He thought of Alara, of the terror in her eyes, and it fueled him. He focused on the feel of the rope, the tiny, almost imperceptible fraying of the fibers. It was like trying to chew through a tree trunk with his teeth, but he did not stop. The moon climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent. The camp was silent now, save for the snores of sleeping men. Just before the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, he felt it. A single strand of the rope gave way, then another. His heart hammered against his bruised ribs. He gave a final, desperate saw, and the rope parted. He lay still for a long moment, his breath catching in his throat. Then, slowly, painstakingly, he worked one hand free from the loosened bonds. The pain as blood rushed back into his numb fingers was so intense it almost made him cry out. He rose to a low crouch, a silent shadow in the pre-dawn gloom. He looked over at Alara, a small, huddled figure by the wagon wheel. He had to get help. He could not fight them all. His gaze fell upon the dying campfire, a bed of red-gold embers. He remembered the small handful of damp leaves he had noticed by a seep in the rock earlier, a detail his mind had filed away. He crept to the spot, gathered them, and returned to the fire. He knew what he had to do. It was a long shot, a desperate cry flung into the wilderness, on the hope that someone was there to see it. He gently placed the wet leaves on the hottest part of the embers. A thick, white smoke began to rise. He used his blanket, which lay discarded near him, to control the plume. He let a small puff escape, then another, then a third. He smothered it for a long count, then lifted the blanket to release one long, continuous column of smoke. He smothered it again, and then released 3 more short, quick puffs. It was not a random signal. It was a language his uncle, Ironhawk, had taught him as a boy, a message of dire distress, a plea for aid, a locator for his kin. He stared as the smoke rose in the still air, a fragile, vertical line against the coming dawn, and prayed that the eyes of his people were watching. Their arrival at Redemption Gulch was a descent into hell. The entire town, it seemed, had turned out to greet them. It was not a welcoming party. It was a mob. They lined the single street, their faces a gallery of grotesques, twisted with a single, unified expression of bloodthirsty hatred. They were no longer individual blacksmiths, merchants, and farmers. They had become a single, monstrous entity, a beast baying for blood. Silas Thorne stood on the porch of his saloon, arms crossed over his barrel chest, a Roman emperor presiding over a spectacle of his own making. In the center of the town square, a new and terrible structure dominated the landscape, a freshly built gallows, its raw pine stark and pale against the dust, a single rope swaying gently in the morning breeze. Ethan was hauled down from his horse and shoved forward. The mob surged, screaming insults, their spittle flying. Men threw stones and rotten vegetables. Women shrieked curses. Elara was pulled down beside him, and the crowd's venom was directed at her as well, calling her a traitor to her race, a savage's whore. She was terrified, her body trembling, but she held her head high, her eyes flashing with a defiant fire that refused to be extinguished. Ethan, his face a swollen, bloody mask, walked with a steady gait, his gaze sweeping over the mob, over the gallows, and finally, up to the ridges that surrounded the town. He was looking for a sign, for a hope that his desperate prayer had been answered. He was shoved through the crowd toward the gallows, the mob parting before him like a foul, stinking sea. Silas Thorne descended the steps of his porch, his face alight with smug, absolute power. He snatched the noose from the gallows beam and personally threw it over Ethan's neck, pulling it tight with a vicious jerk. Thorne turned to face his town, his people, his mob. He raised his hands for silence. "People of Redemption Gulch," he boomed, his voice dripping with self-righteous authority. "You see before you a savage and a thief. He crept into our town and stole this woman. And when our brave sons went to bring her back, he resisted. For his crimes of abduction and attempted murder, I find him guilty, and he will pay the price." A roar of approval went up from the crowd, a deafening, inhuman sound. The frenzy was reaching its peak. The beast was about to be fed. And then it happened. A change. It began at the back of the crowd, a sudden quiet that spread forward, one person at a time, like a fast-moving frost. The roar faltered, sputtered, and died. A chilling, profound, and unnatural silence fell over the entire town square. Men who had been shouting for blood now stood frozen, their mouths agape. Their eyes were all turned upward, not to the gallows, but to the high sun-baked ridges that formed a natural wall around the town. On the crest of the eastern ridge, a figure had appeared, a man on horseback, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Then another appeared beside him, and another. Then, on the western ridge, the same thing. And to the north and the south, on all sides, on every high point overlooking the town, warriors had materialized from the very earth. They were Comanche, mounted on wiry war ponies, their faces grim, their bodies streaked with paint. They sat motionless, holding lances that pricked the sky, bows slung over their shoulders, the sun glinting off the barrels of their rifles. They did not scream, they did not charge, they simply sat, a silent, disciplined, and terrifying ring of steel and judgment, completely cutting the town off from the rest of the world. At their head, on the highest point to the east, sat a formidable figure in a full eagle feather war bonnet. It was Ironhawk. Ethan's prayer had been answered. The town was a cage, and the door had just been slammed shut. The bravado of the mob evaporated in an instant, replaced by a stark, collective terror. The hunters had become the trapped. Every man who had been shouting for a hanging now felt the cold touch of a noose around his own neck. Then, one of the riders began to move. Ironhawk urged his horse down the long, steep slope, descending into the valley of fear he had just created. He rode alone, his presence radiating an aura of ancient, implacable authority that made Silas Thorne's blustering power seem like a child's tantrum. He rode into the town square, his horse's hooves making soft, deliberate sounds in the dead silence. He stopped a few yards from the gallows, but he did not even glance at Silas Thorne. He looked past him, his dark, penetrating gaze sweeping over the ashen faces of the townspeople, judging them, weighing them. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was calm and clear, and it carried to every corner of the square. He spoke in heavily accented, but perfectly clear English. "We have not come for war," he stated, his eyes missing nothing. "We have come for justice." He raised a hand and pointed, not at Ethan, but at Ilara, who stood pale and trembling beside the gallows. "A woman in your town showed kindness to my nephew. For this, she was brutalized. Her hands were broken. Her life was threatened. We have not come for land or for horses. We have come for the men who did this. Justice. For her." His gaze finally fell upon the Thorne family. "We demand the 2 sons who broke her hands. We demand the father who raised dogs instead of men and sent them to do this work. Give them to us." His voice dropped, becoming as cold and hard as stone. "The rest of you can live, but if you protect them, this town will be nothing but ashes and bone by sunset. The choice is yours." The ultimatum hung in the silent air. Panic, raw and immediate, erupted. The fragile loyalty of the mob, a thing built on fear and greed, shattered completely in the face of their own annihilation. They were not willing to die for Silas Thorne's pride. The single monstrous entity of the mob splintered back into hundreds of terrified, self-interested individuals, all desperate to save their own skin. A man at the front of the crowd, the blacksmith, a man who had been shouting for Ethan's death only moments before, now turned on his master. "Thorne!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "This is your doing! You brought this on us!" It was a spark in a powder keg. The cry was taken up by others. "Give them the thorns! It is their fault! Save the town!" The mob, which had surged toward Ethan with such hatred, now turned with an even greater fury upon its leaders, in a swift, brutal, and stunning reversal of fortune. The townspeople swarmed the gallows. Silas Thorne and his sons, too stunned by the sudden turn of events to even resist, were seized by dozens of hands. Their guns were ripped from their belts. They were punched, kicked, and dragged from the platform, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. The mob shoved them forward, pushing them, stumbling and pleading, toward the impassive, waiting war chief. The town, in a desperate act of self-preservation, had just sacrificed its king. The townspeople of Redemption Gulch shoved their fallen king and his princes forward, a human sacrifice offered up to appease the wrathful gods on the ridge. Silas Thorne, his face a mask of apoplectic disbelief, stumbled before Ironhawk's war pony, Jeb and Caleb, their arrogant cruelty having curdled into a sniveling, pathetic terror, were thrown to the dust beside him. The mob then scrambled back, a fearful herd creating a wide, empty space around the judged and their judge. "I am Silas Thorne," he blustered, his voice a pathetic imitation of its former authority. "This is my town. I can pay you. Gold, cattle, whatever you want." Ironhawk did not deign to look at him. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, who still stood by the gallows, the noose hanging loosely around his neck. One of the warriors, a man with a face like a carved hawk, dismounted, walked to Ethan, and with a single, sharp slice of his knife, cut the ropes binding his hands. He then lifted the noose from Ethan's neck and threw it to the ground as if it were a dead snake. Only then did Ironhawk turn his cold, dark eyes upon the 3 men groveling in the dirt. He spoke, his voice calm and measured, a chilling counterpoint to the raw fear of the Thorns. "A man who must declare he is a chief is no chief," he said, his words falling like stones into the silence. "And a man who offers gold for justice understands neither." He paused, letting the weight of his contempt settle over them. A quick death is a warrior's end. It is an honorable way to pass from this world to the next. You have not earned that honor. Ethan watched, a grim understanding dawning on his face. He knew the ways of his mother's people. Justice was not merely about punishment. It was about balance. It was about making the punishment fit the crime, not in blood, but in spirit. A quick bullet or a sharp knife would be a mercy, and the thorns had shown no mercy. Ironhawk continued, his voice resonating through the square. You used your power to break a helpless woman. You found pleasure in her terror. You condemned her to a life of helplessness. He looked from Jeb to Caleb, his eyes lingering on their hands, the instruments of their cruelty. So, you will learn the meaning of these things. You will know what it is to be powerless. You will know what it is to be terrified. You will know what it is to be helpless. At a silent signal from their chief, 2 warriors dismounted. They moved with a swift, brutal efficiency. They ripped the pistols from the Thorns' belts and threw them aside. They pulled the fine, tooled leather boots from their feet, leaving them barefoot in the sharp dust and gravel. They used strips of rawhide to bind their hands tightly behind their backs. Silas Thorne, his face purple with impotent rage, tried to struggle, but a sharp blow from a warrior's elbow silenced him. They were stripped of their weapons, their status, their very ability to fend for themselves. You will be exiled, Ironhawk pronounced, his voice the final, unassailable judgment. You will be sent west, into the Badlands, with nothing but the clothes on your backs and the shame you have earned. You will walk where there is no water. You will face the sun with no cover. The land will be your judge, and the coyotes will be your jury. Your life in this place is over. Their power, their pride, and their reign of fear in Redemption Gulch were utterly and completely annihilated. Justice, Comanche style, was not a quick ending, but a slow, agonizing erasure. The warriors prodded the 3 men with the ends of their lances, forcing them to their feet. They marched them, stumbling and barefoot, to the western edge of town and pushed them out into the unforgiving wilderness. The town watched in stunned silence as the 3 figures, who had once been titans, dwindled into pathetic, helpless specks on the vast, hostile plain. With the judgment rendered, Ironhawk raised a hand. Without a word, without a sound, the warriors on the ridges turned their horses and began to melt back into the landscape. They disappeared as silently and mysteriously as they had appeared. A phantom army that had emerged from the earth to right a terrible wrong and then receded, leaving the world to its own devices. They were a force of nature, and the storm had passed. The town they left behind was a place of stunned, uneasy quiet. The gallows stood empty and absurd, a monument to a fever that had broken. The power vacuum left by the Thorns' fall was a palpable thing, a gaping void in the center of the town's soul. The people of Redemption Gulch looked at one another, their faces a mixture of shame, relief, and a dawning, uncertain fear of what came next. They looked at Ethan and Alara, the 2 catalysts for this cataclysmic change, not with hatred anymore, but with a kind of awe. Ethan walked to where his uncle sat upon his horse. The formidable war chief's face softened as he looked at his nephew. Kavi, Ironhawk said, using his childhood name. Your mother's spirit is strong in you. You have endured much. He looked over at Alara, who stood watching them, her posture radiating a quiet, weary strength. She has the heart of a warrior. There is a place for you both with us, a place of honor. Come home. The offer was made with genuine warmth, a promise of belonging that Ethan had longed for his entire life. He felt the pull of it, the desire to finally be a part of a people, to have a home. But then his gaze fell on Alara. He saw her standing there, so pale and out of place in this harsh, dusty world. He knew that even if she were welcomed, even if she were honored, she would always be an outsider among the people. She would be safe, but she would never truly belong, just as he had never truly belonged in the white world. Their life together could not be built on the foundation of his past. It had to be built on a future that was entirely their own. He shook his head, a gesture of profound regret but absolute certainty. "Thank you, Uncle," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You have given me my life. You have given me hers. But our path is not with the people. We must find our own way, a place that belongs to us both." Ironhawk held his gaze for a long moment, and in his dark eyes there was not disappointment, but a deep understanding. He reached down and clasped Ethan's shoulder firmly. "May the spirits guide your trail, my sister's son," he said. Then, without another word, he turned his war pony and rode away, the last of the phantom army to disappear into the vastness of the plains. Ethan and Alara were finally alone, two still figures in the center of a town that did not know what to do with them. He went to her, and the townspeople, as if by some unspoken agreement, shuffled away, giving them their space, their silence a mixture of fear and respect. He led her away from the square, away from the gallows and the staring eyes, into the quiet, hay-scented gloom of the livery stable. The adrenaline of the past hours faded, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness, filled only with the deep, throbbing ache of his wounds and the heavier, more persistent ache of his guilt. He looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek where Caleb had struck her, at the exhaustion that etched fine lines around her eyes, and the weight of it all settled on his soul. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. The splints were gone, but the evidence of her ordeal was still there. Her fingers were stiff and angry. Raised scars traced a brutal map across her delicate skin. They were a permanent testament to the price she had paid for a simple glass of water. He traced the scarred lines with the pad of his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. "Alara," he began, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "All of this, what they did to you, what you endured, it was because of me." The guilt was a physical thing, a poison he had carried since that night in her room. "I am so sorry." She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not a hint of blame, only a deep, unwavering tenderness. She slowly pulled one of her hands from his grasp. With a clumsy, determined movement, she reached up and laid her scarred, stiff fingers against his bruised and swollen face. The touch was not soft, but it was the most profound gesture of love and forgiveness he had ever known. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice firm and clear, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You must not say that. You must never think that." Her fingers gently traced the line of his jaw. "Those men, their hate, that is what hurt me. That is the evil that broke my hands. You," she said, her voice softening, "you were not the cause of my pain. You were the reason I survived it." Her words were an absolution, a cleansing rain that washed away the poison of his guilt, the dam he had built around his own heart, the one that had held back a lifetime of loneliness and sorrow, finally broke. "I love you, Alara," he breathed, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "From that first moment in the saloon, I love your courage and your kindness, and the strength that you do not even know you have." Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound, soul-shattering joy. "And I love you, Ethan Blackwood," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw the good man that you are, even when you tried to hide him from the world. You saved me, not just from them, but from the person I was becoming. You saved my life, and you saved my soul." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss not of desperate passion, but of deep, reverent love. It was a kiss of vows, a silent promise between two scarred and broken people who had found wholeness in each other. Theirs was a love born of shared trauma and mutual salvation, a bond stronger than steel, forged in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. They knew then that there was no future for them in the world of men. They could not stay in Redemption Gulch, a town haunted by ghosts. They could not seek out another settlement, which would only hold its own brand of prejudice and cruelty. Their place was not on any map. It was a place they had to find for themselves. They gathered what they needed from the general store. The owner, a man who had once sneered at Ethan, now pressed supplies upon them, his hands trembling, refusing any payment. They took their horses, and without a backward glance at the humbled town, they rode out, not east or west, but north, toward the high, remote mountains, seeking not just a place to hide, but a place to live. They traveled for weeks, a slow, meandering journey with no destination but peace. Ethan's skills, once used for mere survival, were now employed in the service of a dream. He read the signs in the land, not for danger, but for promise, for good water, for plentiful game, for shelter from the wind. He led them high into the canyons, far from any trail, to a place the world had forgotten. He found it, a small, hidden valley, nestled between towering walls of red rock, a clear, cold stream, impossibly green with moss and ferns along its banks, ran through its center. The valley floor was a lush carpet of grass, dotted with cottonwoods and ancient, gnarled junipers. It was a place of impossible beauty and profound peace, a sanctuary shielded from the harshness of the world. Months passed. The searing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. In their hidden valley, a new world was taking shape. Ethan, his body healed and filled with a strength that came not just from muscle but from purpose, was building them a home. The steady, rhythmic thud of his axe against pine echoed in the quiet air as he raised the walls of a small, sturdy cabin. Nearby, in a patch of rich, dark earth she had claimed as her own, Alara tended a small garden. The scars on her hands were now pale and silvered. She would never again have the nimble dexterity she once possessed, the ability to do fine needlework or play a delicate tune on a piano. But she had learned to work with her limitations. Her movements were careful, patient, and deliberate as she weeded and watered the hardy vegetables that would see them through the winter. Her spirit, which had once been so close to breaking, was now whole and unbreakable, rooted in this new life as firmly as the plants in her garden. They were exiles. They were scarred. They were utterly and completely alone. But as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across their valley, they stood together, watching the final logs of their home being set into place. They were at peace, and they were together. The story of their suffering had ended, and from the ashes of the old world, on the unshakable foundation of a hard-won love, they were quietly, hopefully, building a new one. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And we invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts.